Have you ever been looked at like you were a mistake? Not because you did something wrong, but just because of the space you occupy? For Florentine Flora Dacre, it was the polite sneer of society matrons whispering that she was too abundant to be a lady. That feeling of wanting to shrink until you disappear, it stays with you. It convinces you that you don't deserve a happy ending. But what happens when the specific imperfection the world rejects becomes the only comfort a broken family can bear? I am too imperfect for love, my lady, but I can work. The housekeeper of the London townhouse stood in the doorway, a silver polishing cloth in her hand and a pitying look in her eye. Every governess with a slender waist has already found a placement, Flora. Married, chosen, or moved to the country. She looked Flora up and down, lingering on the generous swell of her bosom and the flush in her round cheeks. Tell me, do you really think a gentleman wants a girl who looks like a dairymaid in the parlor? Flora's hands stilled on the trunk she was packing. The words hit like a slap, but she'd heard them before. 2 years ago, in a velvet-draped drawing room, she had curtsied before a prospective employer. The lady had laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, when she saw Flora rise. She didn't ask for references. She didn't ask about Flora's French or piano. She just curled her lip and said, "We wanted refinement, Miss Dacre, not abundance." Flora had been ushered out the back door. That sentence never left her. Now the housekeeper was waiting for an answer. Flora folded her plain gray dress slowly. "No, ma'am," she said quietly. "I suppose I am not made to be chosen." The housekeeper sighed, satisfied with the submission. "Then you'd best be quick. My lady closes the house in 10 days. You'll be on the street if you haven't found a corner by then." Flora stood alone in the dim servants' quarters, 5 guineas to her name, nowhere to go. But later that afternoon, tucked inside a discarded ladies' periodical, she saw it, a small text box, plainly worded, almost hidden. "Widower Earl requires capable governess for 3 young children. Discretion essential. Immediate start." She tore the corner of the page. That very hour she spent 2 of her precious guineas on a seat in the mail coach. The carriage rattled up the gravel drive of Crestwood Hall just as the sun was setting behind the weeping willows. Flora stepped onto the drive, clutching her worn carpetbag, and stopped cold. She wasn't the only one answering the advertisement. 3 other young women were already there, standing by the portico, slender, elegant, their bonnets trimmed with expensive silk ribbons. They were laughing softly, whispering about the gloomy estate. A man stood at the top of the stone steps, his cravat slightly undone, his face drawn with an exhaustion that looked like physical pain. Behind him, peering around the heavy oak door, were 3 children, pale, silent, and watching with wide, frightened eyes. The other women approached him like they were doing him a favor. The tallest one, a blonde with a waist no bigger than a span, spoke first. "We expected a staff to receive us, my lord, and the children, are they always this unkempt?" She wrinkled her nose. "I would require a nursemaid to handle the actual washing and dressing. I am here to teach music and etiquette, not to wipe noses." The second woman chimed in, looking at the overgrown rose garden. "And the isolation. I'd need double the wages to stay in a house this quiet. It feels like a tomb." The Earl, Benedict, tightened his jaw. "My wife passed 6 months ago. We are recovering." "That is tragic," the blonde said, checking her pocket watch. "But your requirements are too demanding for the wage. Come, sisters, we can make the inn before dark." They turned and walked away, their laughter drifting back on the evening breeze, mocking the silence of the house. Benedict stood there, defeated. He looked at his hands, then back at the door where his youngest son, Sylvan, had buried his face in his older sister's skirt to hide his tears. Flora's heart broke. She watched the carriage of elegant women pull away, leaving her standing in the dust. She knew she should leave. She knew she wasn't what a man like this wanted. She was too soft, too round, too unrefined. but she looked at the little boy's shaking shoulders. Flora stepped forward, the gravel crunching beneath her sensible boots. Benedict looked up, his eyes hard, expecting another rejection. He took in her flushed cheeks, her breathing heavy from the anxiety, her figure that defied the fashion of the day. "My lord," Flora said, her voice trembling but clear, "I have no nursemaid to ask for, and I am not a lady of fashion." Benedict stared at her. He didn't speak, he didn't mock her, he just looked, unable to look anywhere else. Flora dropped her bag and knelt on the cold stone, holding her hand out to the weeping boy. "I'm too imperfect for love, my lord," she confessed, looking up at the Earl. "But your children, them I could cherish." If stories of quiet courage, healing hearts, and love that arrives when we least expect it touch something inside you, my daughter keeps saying that if this channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, she'll finally let me tell her favorite embarrassing childhood story on air. So please, wherever you're listening from right now, drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where all of you are. Give this video a quick like and hit subscribe. It really does help us keep sharing these tender, hopeful tales with more people who need them. Thank you, truly. The drawing room of Crestwood Hall was vast, beautiful, and utterly devoid of warmth. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that pierced the heavy velvet drapes, illuminating the worn patches on the Persian rug. Flora stood near the door, clutching her reticule with white-knuckled force, acutely aware of how much space she occupied compared to the others. 3 other young women stood near the fireplace. They were everything Flora was not, slender as willow branches, elegant in their pale muslins, and possessing that cool, detached air of high society governesses. They ignored the cold hearth, their heads bent together as they cast sideline glances at Flora's dark green gown. It was her best dress, but the cut was plain, and it did little to hide the generous curve of her bosom and the softness of her hips. "A dairymaid," one whispered, loud enough to carry across the silence. "Surely she knows this is a gentleman's house, not a farmhouse kitchen." "Perhaps she hopes to serve as a wet nurse," another giggled behind a gloved hand. "She certainly has the abundance for it." Flora felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, burning all the way to the tips of her ears. She fixed her gaze on a portrait of a stern ancestor, willing her heart to slow its frantic beating. "Just endure it," she told herself. "They will send you away soon enough." The heavy oak doors opened, and the Earl of Crestwood entered. Lord Benedict looked nothing like the portraits. He was younger, perhaps only 30, but his dark hair was disheveled, and deep lines of exhaustion bracketed a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. Clinging to his leg was a small boy, no more than 4 years old, his face streaked with dried tears. Benedict's gaze swept over the 3 elegant women, who immediately straightened and offered practiced curtsies. Then his eyes landed on Flora. He paused, his brow furrowing as he took in her flushed countenance and the soft, unhidden curves of her figure. The interview was short and brutal. The first 3 candidates spoke of French verbs and piano scales, but when the little boy whimpered, they flinched, their disdain for the interruption clear. Benedict dismissed them with a sharp wave of his hand. As the door clicked shut behind them, the silence in the room grew heavy. "And you?" Benedict asked, his voice rough with disuse. He looked at Flora, his eyes weary. "You do not look like a governess, Miss Dacre. Society would say you lack the discipline of figure required for a household of reputation. Why should I believe you are suitable?" Flora looked at the Earl, then down at the little boy trembling against his father's knee. The shame of the other women's whispers still stung, but the grief in this room was louder. She took a step forward, her voice quiet but steady. "I have no French polish, my lord, and I know what the world fees when they look at me." She met his gaze. I am too imperfect for love, I know, but your children, them I could cherish." Benedict stood speechless, the harsh lines of his face softened in sheer surprise. He looked at her, really looked at her, not with the sneer of a critic, but with the desperation of a drowning man spotting a shore. Without a word, he reached down and peeled the clinging boy from his leg. He didn't call for a nurse, he didn't ring a bell, he simply stepped forward and placed his son, Sylvan, into Flora's arms. The weight of the child settled against her chest, warm and solid. Sylvan didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath and immediately buried his face in the soft curve of her shoulder, his small hand gripping the fabric of her plain green dress as if he had finally found somewhere soft to land. Crestwood Hall was a masterpiece of architecture, with soaring ceilings and velvet drapes that should have held the scent of lavender and beeswax. Instead, the air was stagnant, smelling faintly of old ash and neglect. The portraits in the gallery were obscured by a thin film of gray dust, and the schoolroom, when Flora first opened the door, was so cold her breath misted in the air. It was a room where laughter had gone to die. Flora did not sit at the rigid instructor's desk. Instead, she knelt before the hearth, coaxing a reluctant fire into life until the gloom retreated into the corners. "We shall not learn staring at a slate today," she told the children softly. "Come, sit by the warmth." By late afternoon, the transformation was subtle but profound. Lord Benedict, walking down the corridor with the heavy tread of a man who dreaded his own home, stopped abruptly. He heard a sound that had been absent from Crestwood for nearly a year, a soft, tentative giggle. He moved to the open doorway and froze. The scene before him looked like a painting by an old master, bathed in the gold and amber glow of the firelight. Flora sat on the rug, her skirts spread wide. Sylvan was curled against her side, his thumb in his mouth, eyes heavy with peaceful sleep. Penelope, the middle child, was leaning forward, entranced by the book in Flora's hand. Even the stiff atmosphere seemed to have softened, the room warming not just from the coals, but from the presence of the woman in the center of it. Flora's voice was a low, melodic hum as she read. The firelight caught the flush of her cheeks and the soft curve of her throat. She looked undeniably earthy, a creature of blood and breath in a house of ghosts. Benedict felt a strange tightness in his chest, a cracking of the ice that had encased him since Eleanor's death. Later that evening, after the nurse had taken the children up, Flora entered the library to return a volume. She found Benedict standing by the unlit fireplace, staring into the dark. "Miss Dacre," he said, his voice rough. He turned, motioning to the silver tea service on the low table. "Please sit." It was highly irregular for a master to sit with his employee, but Flora sensed the fragility in him. She poured the tea, her hands steady, the china clinking softly in the quiet room. "I stood outside the door today," Benedict confessed, looking at the steam rising from his cup rather than at her. "Sylvan, he has not slept without screaming in months. Today he looked safe." "He is only grieving, my lord," answered Flora gently. "He needed to know he could rest his head without falling." Benedict lifted his gaze then. In the dim candlelight he saw not the unseemly abundance the society matrons had sneered at, but a profound capability for comfort. "You are bringing life back to this house, Flora. I do not know how to thank you." Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the air between them grew charged and heavy, filled with words neither dared to speak. But not everyone found comfort in the change. As Flora left the library, a shadow detached itself from the upper landing. Aurelia, the eldest daughter, watched her governess retreat, her young face set in a mask of stony resentment. No one was allowed to take Mama's place, and she would make sure Flora understood that. If the nursery was beginning to thaw under Flora's presence, the schoolroom remained a fortress of winter, guarded zealously by 12-year-old Aurelia. The girl was a miniature statue of her father, dark-haired, pale, and possessed of a silence that felt like a judgment. "Non, mademoiselle," Aurelia corrected sharply one rainy Tuesday, slamming her grammar book shut. "That is not how it is spoken. Mamma said the R must be rolled at the back of the throat. Your accent is rustic." Flora felt the sting of the insult, but she merely smoothed the front of her skirts, her patience as deep as the pockets of her plain gown. "Then perhaps you shall teach me, Aurelia. I would not wish to dishonor your mother's lessons." Aurelia turned away, her small shoulders rigid. She refused Flora's help with her penmanship, would not eat the scones Flora brought up from the kitchen, and when Flora sat by the fire to braid little Penelope's hair, Aurelia watched with eyes that burned. To her, every ribbon Flora tied felt like a theft. Every comfort Flora offered felt like an erasure of the woman who had stood there before. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon. The house was quiet, the rain lashing against the leaded canes. Flora entered the nursery to find Aurelia huddled in the window seat, frantically trying to mend a tear in an expensive porcelain doll silk dress. Her movements were jerky, fueled by frustration and a refusal to ask for aid. Suddenly, the needle slipped. Aurelia gasped, dropping the doll as a bright bead of crimson welled up on her finger. She cradled her hand to her chest, her face crumbling not from the pain, but from the failure. When Flora moved toward her, Aurelia scrambled back. "Don't! I don't need you. I wanted to fix it myself." Flora didn't hover. She didn't scold. She simply sank to her knees on the rug, bringing her face level with the girl's. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her sleeve and gently took Aurelia's hand. "The silk is slippery," Flora said softly, wrapping the linen around the small, trembling finger. "It fights even the best seamstresses." Aurelia sniffed, refusing to meet her eyes. "It's ruined. Mamma gave it to me." Flora picked up the doll and examined the tear. It was jagged, but the fabric was salvageable. She looked at the embroidery sampler hanging on the nursery wall, unfinished, but the stitches were tiny, precise, and perfect. "May I show you how your mamma used to do the stitches?" Flora asked, her voice barely a whisper. "See how she turned the thread under here? If we do it that way, no one will ever know it was torn." Aurelia looked up, her defenses wavering. "You know how she did it?" "I know that she took great care with beautiful things," Flora murmured, "and I can help you do the same." The tears finally spilled over. Aurelia didn't pull away this time. She shifted on the window seat, making room for Flora's abundance beside her. For the next hour there was no sound but the rain and the soft snap of thread as Flora guided Aurelia's hands, teaching her to mend what was broken, stitch by careful stitch. But while the children were beginning to find solace in her warmth, the master of the house remained a closed book, one whose cover Flora was terrified to open, for he still could not bear to speak the name of the woman they were all mourning. The silence in the drawing room was usually peaceful now, filled with the scratch of charcoal on paper or the soft turn of a page. But on this Tuesday evening, the silence shattered. Little Penelope, sitting on the rug with her sketchbook, looked up at the paneled walls where generations of Crestwood ancestors stared down. She frowned, her small brow crinkling. "Papa?" she asked, her voice high and clear in the quiet room. "Why are there no paintings of Mama? Is she hiding from us?" The scratching of Aurelia's pen stopped. Flora froze, her needle hovering over her embroidery. Lord Benedict turned the color of ash. The teacup in his hand rattled against the saucer as he set it down, hard. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floorboards. He didn't look at his daughter. He didn't look at Flora. He simply turned and walked out of the room, the heavy oak door closing behind him with a finality that made Sylvan flinch. Flora set her work aside. "Stay with your brother," she whispered to Aurelia, who nodded, her eyes wide with a shared, silent fear. Flora found him in the portrait gallery. The long corridor was shadowed, lit only by the moonlight spilling through the high windows. Benedict stood at the far end, staring at a large canvas draped in heavy black velvet. He looked like a man made of stone, unable to move forward or back. Flora approached him slowly, the rustle of her skirts the only sound. She didn't touch him, that would be overstepping, but she stood close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. "She is not gone from this house, my lord," said Flora softly, "only from your voice." Benedict gripped the edge of the velvet cloth, his knuckles white. "If I see her, if I speak of her, I will break." "You are already broken," Flora answered, her voice trembling with the boldness of the truth. "And the children are trying to put the pieces together in the dark. They think her memory is a forbidden room they cannot enter." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a plea. "They need to hear her name, my lord. They need to know it doesn't hurt you to remember. If you silence her memory, you lose her twice." Benedict's shoulders shook. He lowered his head until his chin touched his chest. For a long, agonizing minute, there was no sound. Then a whisper cracked the air, hoarse, ragged, and full of pain. "Eleanor." As he spoke it, the tension seemed to drain from his body, replaced with a grief that was finally humanly flowing. A single tear tracked through the dust of his solitude. That Sunday, the village saw a sight that had not occurred in a year. The Earl's carriage did not stop at the church gate. Instead, the family walked together to the marble mausoleum on the hill. The heavy iron gates were opened. Benedict held Sylvan's hand, and Flora walked a respectable distance behind, watching as the father finally introduced his children to the memory of their mother, his voice steady in the quiet morning air. The climbing roses in the east garden had grown wild in their grief, tangling over the trellis in a chaotic embrace of thorns and new buds. Flora, sleeves rolled to her elbows and a smudge of earth on her cheek, stood on a wooden crate, attempting to guide a particularly stubborn cane back into place. She did not hear the Earl approach across the grass until he was right beside her. "Allow me," Benedict said, his voice low. He didn't wait for permission. He reached up, his height giving him the advantage she lacked, and caught the wandering stem. For an hour, they worked in a companionable silence that felt more intimate than conversation. The air smelled of damp earth and crushing green sap. As Benedict held a heavy branch in place, Flora reached up to secure it with twine. Her fingers brushed against his, warm, strong, and calloused from the work. Neither of them pulled away. Flora's breath hitched. She looked up, startled by the sudden stillness of the man beside her. Benedict was looking down at her, his eyes tracing the line of her throat, the flushed warmth of her skin, the stray curl escaping her cap. For the first time, Flora did not feel too much. She felt seen. The moment stretched, fragile as spun glass, before the distant sound of the stable clock chiming the hour pulled them apart. That evening, the intimacy of the garden followed them into the house. Flora sat in the nursery rocking chair, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. Sylvan, fresh from his bath and smelling of lavender soap, climbed wordlessly into her lap. He was heavy now, growing stronger every day, but he curled against her soft curves as if he belonged there. He played with the button of her bodice, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "Miss Flora?" "Yes, my sweet." "I know Mama is in heaven, and she watches us, but heaven is very far away." He looked up, his eyes wide and searching. "Can you be my Mama here, and Mama can be my Mama in heaven?" Flora's heart cracked open. She tightened her arms around him, resting her cheek on his hair, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. From the shadowed doorway, Benedict watched. He had come to say goodnight, but the sight of his son, so small, so trusting, wrapped in Flora's embrace, stopped him cold. He saw the way she held him, not with the stiff duty of a paid employee, but with a fierce, protective tenderness. Later, as Flora descended the stairs, Benedict emerged from the shadows of the landing. He looked shaken, his usual reserve stripped away by what he had witnessed. "Miss Dacre," he said, stopping her. Flora dipped a curtsy, her eyes lowering. "My lord?" He took a step closer, entering her personal space in a way that defied all propriety. "I heard him," Benedict confessed, his voice rough. "I heard what he asked." Flora looked up, panicked. "I would never presume to take her place, my lord. I only—" "No," he interrupted softly. He looked at her, his gaze intense and undeniably warm. "You are not taking a place, Flora. You are making a new one." He hesitated, then spoke the words that would change everything. "You are becoming essential to all of us." But safety, however sweet, is a fragile thing. Just as the first blooms of the season began to open, a carriage bearing the Crestwood crest rolled through the village, carrying a woman who believed that essential was just another word for opportunist. The peace of Crestwood Hall was shattered not by a scream, but by the precise, terrifying scratch of a solicitor's quill. Lady Lavinia, Benedict's formidable aunt, sat in the high-backed chair of the drawing-room like a judge on a dais. Flanking her were two society matrons in stiff black silk, and a solicitor who looked at Flora as if she were a stain on the carpet. "It is not merely her station, Benedict," Lavinia said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "It is her presentation. Look at her." She gestured dismissively at Flora, who stood by the mantel, pale and trembling. "She is a woman of common abundance. To have such a creature acting as a surrogate mother, it is unseemly. People are talking." "Let them talk," Benedict snapped, his hand gripping the back of a chair until his knuckles whitened. "She has restored happiness to this house." "And at what cost to the children's future?" the solicitor interjected smoothly. "If you persist in keeping a governess of such questionable suitability, the family council is prepared to petition for guardianship. We will remove the children to a household with proper standards." The room went cold. Flora looked at Benedict. She saw the terror in his eyes, not for himself, but at the thought of the nursery empty again. "You have 30 days to dismiss her," Lavinia decreed, rising, "or we shall take them." Flora did not wait for the 30 days. She could not be the reason he lost them. Dawn broke gray and weeping over the estate. In the small governess's room, Flora folded her plain gray dress into her trunk. She moved silently, suffocating her own heart to save his. She would slip away before the house awoke, leaving only a letter on the mantel. She clicked the latch of her trunk shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet corridor. Suddenly, the door flew open. Sylvan stood there in his nightshirt, his hair tousled, eyes wide with a panic that understood far more than a child should. Behind him, Aurelia and Penelope hovered, their faces pale ghosts in the gloom. "You're packing," Aurelia whispered, the accusation trembling in the air. "No!" Sylvan screamed, launching himself across the room. He slammed into Flora's legs, wrapping his arms around her skirts with a desperate, terrifying strength. "You can't go! You promised!" Flora sank to her knees, tears finally spilling over. "Sylvan, hush! You must be brave." I don't want to be brave, he sobbed, burying his face in her stomach. I want you. Flora. The voice came from the doorway. Benedict stood there, unshaven, still in his shirt sleeves, looking wild and wrecked. He looked at the trunk, then at the weeping children clinging to her. He crossed the room in 2 strides, ignoring the propriety that had ruled his life for so long. He reached down, covering Flora's hand, the one stroking Sylvan's hair, with his own. His grip was iron hard, the touch of a man holding onto a cliff edge. "Do not finish that packing," he commanded, his voice cracking. He looked into her tear-filled eyes, stripping his soul bare before her and his children. "I have lost my wife. I have lost my peace. Flora, I cannot lose you too." The long gallery had been built to intimidate, lined with the unsmiling faces of Crestwood ancestors, but today the judgment came from the living. Lady Lavinia sat rigid in the center of the room, her solicitor arranging papers that would sever Flora from the children forever. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and impending doom. "The decision is made," Lavinia declared, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "The carriage is waiting. The children require discipline, not sentimentality." "No." The word was quiet, but it stopped the solicitor's hand in midair. Aurelia stepped out from the shadows of the heavy drapes. She looked small against the vastness of the room, but her chin was lifted, her eyes dry and fierce. "Aurelia, return to the nursery," Lavinia snapped. "She did not try to replace Mama," Aurelia said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every syllable. "She just loved us when we were too sad to love ourselves. You want to take her away because she is warm and you are cold." Before Lavinia could gasp, Sylvan and Penelope broke from the nurse's grip, running across the parquet floor to bury themselves in Flora's skirts, forming a barricade of small, defiant bodies. Then a rustle of starch. The housekeeper, the butler, and even the elderly nurse stepped forward from the servants' entrance. "Miss Dacre brought light to a tomb, my lady," the housekeeper stated, breaking a lifetime of protocol. "If she goes, this house dies." Lavinia looked around, her mouth opening and closing, silenced by the wall of unity facing her. Benedict stepped into the center of the room. He did not look at his aunt. He only looked at Flora, at her flushed cheeks, her tear-filled eyes, and the children clinging to her imperfect figure as if they were their only anchor in the world. "Miss Dacre," he said softly, closing the distance between them. He took her free hand, ignoring the gasp from the solicitor. "I have spent a year in the dark. I will not go back." He knelt right there on the hard floor in front of the staff, his aunt, and his children. "I choose you, Flora, not because I must and not for the children alone. I choose you because I cannot imagine another sunrise without you." Lavinia stormed out, her carriage wheels crunching angrily on the gravel, but no one inside heard her leave. They married that very evening in the small family chapel, with only the staff and children as witnesses. The candlelight caught the gold in Flora's hair and the tears on Benedict's face as he vowed to cherish her, abundance and all. 6 months later, the summer sun drenched the rose garden in gold. The tangled briars had been tamed into blooming arches. Laughter, loud and uninhibited, rang out as Sylvan chased a hoop across the lawn. On the stone bench, Benedict sat with his arm draped casually, possessively, around his countess. Flora laughed at something he whispered, turning her face to the sun, radiant, whole, and perfectly, beautifully loved. If this ending wrapped around your heart the way it did mine, don't be the person who watches love stories like this alone forever. Subscribe right now, because the people who quietly close the tab without pressing that button usually come back to the comments later whispering, "I wish I hadn't let this one slip away." Don't be them. Join us for the next one.